We'll now move on to opposition questions, oral questions put by members to ministers. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Premier. Nova Scotians are being asked to buy into a cap-and-trade system without any information about whether this system will actually help the environment or not, Mr. Speaker. In exchange for their sacrifice, they deserve to know how much greenhouse gas emissions will go down under the cap-and-trade plan. How much will other I'll get to the question in a second. How much will other atmospheric emissions go down, whether it's sulfur dioxide, nitrous oxide, or even mercury, Mr. Speaker? But there's been no information shared with Nova Scotians about whether the environment will actually get better under the Premier's cap-and-trade plan. So I would like to ask the Premier if he can share with this House what are the targeted reductions in greenhouse gas emissions and other atmospheric emissions under his cap-and-trade plan.
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. And I want to congratulate and thank all Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker, who for the last decade have been doing a tremendous job in reducing greenhouse gas across the province. Because of them, Mr. Speaker, we were leading the country in greenhouse gas reductions, and it allowed us as a government to go to Ottawa to negotiate what is a made in Nova Scotia solution to ensure that we were recognized for the tremendous work that businesses and individuals did over the last decade when it comes to power rates, and recognize that when they bring in some of the other issues that are going in other Canadian provinces, they don't impact our province in a negative way, which in turn impacts the pocketbooks of Nova Scotia families. What we've been able to negotiate with the national government is a cap-and-trade system which recognizes the hard work by all Nova Scotians, at the same time smoothing out the benefits of that to ensure that we do not get the sticker shock when it comes to motor fuel tax or other aspects of our economy.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm sure you noticed there was not a single answer on environmental improvements or greenhouse gas reductions or any reductions in that answer, Mr. Speaker. In fact, the only thing Nova Scotians know today is what the pricing will be, which is $10 to $50 a tonne. Mr. Speaker, when this government brings an environmental plan before this House that does not have any environmental targets, but only has carbon pricing targets, it is not an environmental plan, it is a taxing plan, Mr. Speaker. That is the problem. And when you bring taxing plans before this House, people want to know what's the effect on the economy, how many jobs is that going to cost. The Premier refuses to share with Nova Scotians any environmental targets. Can he at least assure them they've done an economic impact study and they know how many jobs this will cost?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. Again, I want to reassure him and tell all Nova Scotians and thank them for the tremendous work they've been doing, Mr. Speaker, over the last decade through all political parties when it comes to reducing greenhouse gas production here in our province. We are now 30% reduction from 2005, and by 2030 we'll be 50% reduced, Mr. Speaker, and we're going to continue to find savings and reduce our greenhouse gas reductions. As he would well know, we've continued to operate and work with the national government to ensure that the cap-and-trade system that was the carbon tax that was put in place in British Columbia was not part of the solution for our province. We worked towards ensuring that the cap-and-trade system in other provinces was not the solution for Nova Scotians. What we did is we went on behalf of all Nova Scotians to continue to defend and fight for the fact that they'd continue been working on this issue for over a decade. While other provinces have been ignoring it, Nova Scotians have been succeeding, and we wanted that recognized, and the piece of legislation introduced yesterday recognizes the hard work by all Nova Scotians.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, if the Premier really wanted to thank Nova Scotians, he would be open and transparent with them about whether his cap-and-trade plan actually helps the environment or not, actually costs us jobs in the economy or not, but he will not do that. It is an empty thank you when the government does not want Nova Scotians to see the fine print, which is so obvious today that they don't want Nova Scotians to know whether the environment will actually get better or whether jobs will actually be lost, Mr. Speaker. So I'd like to ask the Premier, why is it that he won't share with Nova Scotians those crucial pieces of information about the environment, about jobs? Is it because they actually don't know?
The Honourable Premier.
No, Mr. Speaker, I want to continue to remind the Honourable Member that we've seen job growth in the last 2 months in this province. We continue to see more young people choose to live and work in this province than we've done for a decade, Mr. Speaker. We continue to see youth unemployment drop. Those are all positive signs, Mr. Speaker. All, not only Nova Scotians, but Canadians recognize the value of what's happening inside of this province. The bigger question is for the Honourable Member, why can't he help celebrate the success of Nova Scotians and stand with their government when they go to Ottawa and defend the best interests of this province?
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you. Last week here in the House, the Premier said more than once that he was not going to allow doctors to, and I quote, hoard the monies of the province. He also referred to amounts in the Doctors Nova Scotia Professional Support Program Fund as a stash. The use of the words hoard and stash is insulting to doctors for obvious reasons, because the clear connotation of these words is selfishness and greed. So I want to ask the Premier if he will retract the use of these words, which he has used in such an imprudent way in the government's current dispute with Doctors Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. Again, I want to thank all those doctors across this province who are working in collaborative care centres, are working individually to ensure the primary care access for all Nova Scotians. Again, I want to tell the honourable member what he's referring to, Mr. Speaker, is that whether it's a medical cost, whether it's dental costs, whether it's malpractice insurance, all of which is paid for by the taxpayers of Nova Scotia, all of which has been paid for by the taxpayers of Nova Scotia. What's in dispute is an additional $4.4 million that not doctors, let me be clear about this, is Doctors Nova Scotia is hoarding and stashing in their portfolio. We want that money to come back to Nova Scotia government so that we can invest in frontline healthcare services that we know Nova Scotians are requiring.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, this is an entirely unhelpful distinction to distinguish between the doctors of Nova Scotia and Doctors Nova Scotia. A piece was written about this in the media this weekend by Dr. Don Pugsley in Truro, who took exception with the Minister of Health's having made this very same distinction. Then Dr. Pugsley went on to liken the government's current actions to those of the Liberal government in the 90s, whose unilateral cuts to physician payments led to the loss of many family physicians and specialists across the province. It is not a way to reach out in negotiation to speak with these kinds of very loaded words. And so I would also ask the Premier if he would like to reconsider what he has just said and point out that he really does understand that the doctors of Nova Scotia and Doctors Nova Scotia are the same.
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, again, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. There's really a philosophical difference here, Mr. Speaker. When they had an opportunity in government, what they did was they brought in every union boss you could find, and they sat around and negotiated a pay raise that this province simply could not afford to pay, Mr. Speaker. So they chose, Mr. Speaker, to stand next to all the union leaders in this province when frontline teachers, healthcare workers were all being cut and starved, Mr. Speaker, in classrooms. We've taken a different approach, Mr. Speaker. We've invested the $65 million back in classrooms across this province. We've invested in collaborative care centres across this province. This current budget will invest in over 70 inside of this province. And, Mr. Speaker, we presented a wage package that is affordable. And what we said to every organization, every union in this province, your membership can afford to pay for their union. Taxpayers need to pay for services for all Nova Scotians.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sure that the physicians of the province will be comforted by this measured and reflective response. I want to ask the Premier about a related but somewhat different matter. Yesterday, media reports in Cape Breton indicated that the Northside General Hospital was raising money through a Chase the Ace event. The Executive Director of the Northside Harbourview Hospital Foundation made clear that each year they receive a wish list from the Nova Scotia Health Authority, and then the Foundation makes purchases for the hospital based on these requests. The items that hospital foundations like the Northside Harbourview are fundraising for aren't multi-million-dollar upgrades, but rather relatively simple pieces of infrastructure like patient lifts. Does the Premier think it makes sense that while the Department of Health underspent its budget last year by $31 million, communities are having to pay for patient lifts with Chase the Ace?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, again, I want to thank community members across this province who continue to support public infrastructure in every way that possible. The honourable member raises a question that I think is important in this House. It was brought up by successive ministers of health, and I think there's a number on the other side when the capital budget is underspent. It raises a simple question, Mr. Speaker, why? We know there are times when we budget stuff that either the construction hasn't happened for that time, piece of equipment hasn't arrived in that current budget year, but that money is actually spent on that equipment, and we'll continue to make those investments. The honourable member also raised the question, Mr. Speaker, about whether or not people understood the position that I have. One thing that I'm very proud of, Mr. Speaker, in the last 4 years of being the Premier of this province, I've been very direct and honest with Nova Scotians, and they've responded in a honest way.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, I have with me a copy of the Highway 104 Western Alignment Act, the laws of the province of Nova Scotia that govern the Cobequid Pass toll road, Mr. Speaker, and I would just like to quote for the Premier, Section 13.2, which says, tolls shall cease to be imposed or collected in respect of the Western Alignment, which is the Cobequid Pass Highway, when all costs and liabilities relating thereto have been paid or otherwise discharged. It does not say some tolls, Mr. Speaker. It says tolls. Tolls means all tolls. I would like to ask the Premier to be open and honest with the people of Cumberland County and tell them that he will respect the laws of the province of Nova Scotia and commit to removing all tolls when the debts are discharged, which is estimated to be 2019.
I'd like to remind the Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition the phrasing of your question there to ask the Premier to be open and honest is inferring that he's not being open and honest, so I'll just make note of that. The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I know what the honourable member meant, that he would never call into question my integrity, Mr. Speaker. But I will tell the honourable member that what I've said and what we continue to say is that by 2019, which we believe is the date that that'll be the bond will be paid off in advance. I think it's 8 years in advance. That toll will be removed for all Nova Scotians. What we've said, we're going to continue to have a conversation whether or not that toll stays on, Mr. Speaker, for large trucks as well as for tourists that are coming into our province. And I want to reassure the member and all Nova Scotians that if there's any toll left on that piece of highway, that fund will be used to continue to improve 100 series highway infrastructure across our province. One of the things I think all Nova Scotians should be positive about, Mr. Speaker, is the fact that when that Cobequid Pass was put in place, what it was put in place for was to reduce the deaths on that highway. As a matter of fact, it was named Death Valley. What we want to continue to make sure is that we continue to make those important infrastructure investments, whether it's in the Barney Rivers, whether it's on the South Shore or the Annapolis Valley, to continue to make our roads safer.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, I need to remind the Premier it was a Liberal government in 1995 that imposed the toll highway on the people of Cumberland County. Now, 20 years later, it's a Liberal government that has inherited the toll highway at a time when the debt is about to be paid off, Mr. Speaker. A deal is a deal. It is ironic that it would be this Liberal government that feels they want to have a conversation about whether to honour a commitment that was made to the people of Cumberland County or not at the time that this very bill was passed into law, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, the Premier said the government might like to continue to collect tolls from some people to pay for all the 100 series highways of the province, Mr. Speaker. So I'd like to ask the Premier, why is he singling out the people of Cumberland County, their visitors and their businesses, to pay a toll when no one else has to?
The Honourable Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, again, I want to thank the Honourable question. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank on behalf of all those families, quite frankly, over the last 2.5 decades, Mr. Speaker, were spared the sorrow of losing a loved one on that piece of highway. The matter of fact is, the government of the day, I wasn't part of that conversation, but I'm going to tell you, it's a difficult conversation when you're sitting there, where do I find the capital to improve infrastructure to ensure we save lives across this province? They made a decision, and I can guarantee you, Mr. Speaker, that families who had lost one prior to that wished a previous government had made the same decision to put in piece of infrastructure that made it safer for family to move about this province. We will continue to do so, and what I've said, for those people who live in Cumberland County, that toll will be removed.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth North.
Mr. Speaker, for recipients of income assistance, some types of income get deducted from their benefits while others are exempt and do not affect the total amount of assistance paid. Court-ordered child support is currently treated as income and clawed back. This has a significant negative impact on the financial security of single parents and their children. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Community Services. Will she agree to follow the lead of her Liberal colleagues in Ontario and end the clawback of child support from single parents on income assistance?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
I want to thank the honourable member for the question, and indeed this is one of the things that we're looking at through our transformation process. We know that it is occurring elsewhere, and we're looking into that. Thank you.
The honourable member for Dartmouth North.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Premier. Other child-related amounts, like the Canada Child Benefit, do not affect income assistance payments. Ending the clawback of child support would put an average of $2,000 annually per child back in the pockets of single parents receiving income assistance. We have often heard the Premier speak about his commitment to strengthening maintenance enforcement to collect the millions owed to children. And I'm concerned that these efforts will have no benefit for children whose parents receive income assistance. So, hearing what the Minister of Community Services said, my question is for the Premier. Does the Premier think it's appropriate for his government to be clawing back this money from single parents and their children?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. She go back to election night in 2013, Mr. Speaker. Part of my election night speech was about this very issue. What happens between two adults is between two adults, Mr. Speaker. But when it impacts their children, whether you're a father in this province or a mother in this province who's ordered to pay maintenance for children, we expect you to pay it. Mr. Speaker, there's far too much money owed to children in this province where people are using it to go against their spouse when in actual fact it's money related to those children. It's exactly why. In the last budget, it's exactly why we've increased support and maintenance and enforcement, and will continue to do so. And the very issue you brought up, the Minister and I spoke about 2 days ago, we'll continue to make sure that the children in this province are respected the way they should be, and what happens between the two adults is their business. But when it comes to the children of this province, we have a collective responsibility to ensure they are treated properly.
It's like to remind the Honourable Premier not to refer to members opposite directly. The Honourable Member for Pictou West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Minister of Justice. Yesterday, the Minister indicated that 22,000 completed the online survey regarding the legalization of marijuana. I'm hoping that today the Minister can confirm out of that 22,000, how many are actually over 18?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my colleague for the question. What I can confirm with my colleague, Mr. Speaker, is that over 27,000 Nova Scotians, unique hits to the survey, Mr. Speaker. Individuals, Mr. Speaker, not multiple repeat, have accessed the site, Mr. Speaker, for purposes of gathering more attention, more information, and taking advantage of the opportunity to respond, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Pictou West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's perplexing to think that that is individuals when I know for certain you can repeat it. And I'll say it again. You can use the same IP address. You can use the same device. It's an unsecured survey site, easy to be manipulated by any age. It's as simple as that, Mr. Speaker. So when the survey actually concludes on October 27th, will the Minister be satisfied to make major decisions on the legalization of marijuana based on inaccurate results?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for the question. Mr. Speaker, this is about public access. If you take a computer in the library, Mr. Speaker, at the New Halifax Library, if we were to restrict access, Mr. Speaker, the first and only time that computer is used to access the survey.
The Honourable Minister of Justice has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, it is about maximizing the opportunities for Nova Scotians to contribute their opinions and thoughts around the legalization of cannabis in the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. The survey is simply one element, Mr. Speaker, of the decision-making process, and I assure my colleague, Mr. Speaker, we will make decisions in the best interest of Nova Scotians.
The Honourable Member for Sackville-Beaverbank.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday the CBC highlighted the impact that EHS offload delays have on patient care. In some cases, patients are reported to have waited hours to be transferred, and I'd like to table that. Mr. Speaker, the delays could easily be tied to a lack of available clinics and ERs across this province. The health care system in Nova Scotia is in crisis, but we know that there are a few simple fixes for issues like this one here. If more ERs were available more often, we would have more paramedics able to do what they're able to do best and not waiting in hospitals for hours. Mr. Speaker, my question is, does Minister Delory agree that the opening of additional Minister of Health, my apologies, I will get this, Mr. Speaker. Does Minister of Health agree that opening up additional emergency rooms will help solve this issue?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. Obviously, emergency access to healthcare services when needed by Nova Scotia is an important topic. We know we have one of the best EHS emergency response systems, Mr. Speaker, in the country. They do a great job, and the services being provided by our paramedics right across this province are top-notch, Mr. Speaker. The times that the member referenced in those ERs that he referenced, I believe he suggested that opening new ERs would be an easy or a simple solution, Mr. Speaker, was the language that he used, Mr. Speaker. I think he recognizes that there are many
communities. Order, please. The Honourable Minister of Health has the floor. This will be the last time I'll make reference to the lack of respect for the chair in the interruptions. The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just in conclusion, as said, the member, I believe, made reference that it was one of the simple solutions, opening additional ERs. But, Mr. Speaker, I think the member also recognizes that there are many ERs that we have across this province where we struggle to staff them appropriately based on changes in the primary health care availability of staffing. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Sackville-Beaverbank.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I clarify, I said that I think there are a few simple fixes that can help to address these issues. You know, despite, I do agree with the Minister of Health. I do think that we do have world-class physicians, healthcare workers here in our hospital, particularly here in HRM. Mr. Speaker, I think that the Cobequid Community Health Centre in Sackville is an example of one of these wonderful facilities. I think Sackville's lucky to have it. However, I think it could be better utilized to resolve the issues. My question, Mr. Speaker, is will the Minister commit to making a plan to open the Cobequid Health Centre on a 24-hour basis? Thank you.
Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And again, I appreciate the member's question. We've spoken previously about how important a role the Cobequid Centre plays, not just for his community where it's physically located, but indeed for individuals that live in surrounding communities that obtain healthcare services at that location, Mr. Speaker. I can assure the member opposite that indeed the Department of Health and Wellness, the health authorities, both the IWK and the Nova Scotia Health Authority, are indeed work on a daily basis towards the plans to improve our healthcare access, Mr. Speaker. Again, not just for the people in his community, but for all Nova Scotians from one end of the province to the other. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Minister of Education. Mr. Speaker, volunteers are the heart of every school district in this province. Thinking outside of the box is a watchword that this government uses very loosely, and many times are telling the community you have to think outside the box. The community of Lewisburg did just that, Mr. Speaker. So my question is, why did the government repeatedly offer its support to the George D. Lewis Gateways to Opportunity Society, but then, following the election, ended their support with a 2-paragraph email to the society saying they weren't interested anymore?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In fact, the government was very excited about this opportunity. We had put money on the table for the school board's consideration to move forward with this project. After the election, I did communicate our desire to move forward with this project to Darren Gugu, who is the chairperson of the board. As the member would know, based on his understanding of the Education Act and its regulations and policies, there's no ability for a minister to overturn the decision of a school board on a closure. In this particular case, we had indicated we wanted to move forward with this project. The school board had indicated that they weren't interested. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's interesting to hear the minister's answers where there's no ability to turn over the decision of a school board, and yet he is the very minister that said we're going to do a review of all the school boards. We're going to do a review of how they close schools. So my question to you, Mr. Speaker, through you, I should say, is to the Premier. Does he agree with the statement that was just made by his minister, considering the fact that on live provincial television, he was going around telling everybody what a great idea the George D. Lewis Opportunities program was?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I still believe it is. It's why we put money on the table. But ultimately, we need a partner, and that's the school board. Final decision is up to the school board. I still believe it was one of those community hubs that actually would have worked. We had a private sector partner who actually had money on the table. We had institutions that were prepared. We had the municipality that was prepared to come forward. But the fact of the matter is, the honourable member is correct. The final decision is up to the school board. Before we went back to the school board, we went there with the full understanding of the collaboration that was happening in that community. We went there also with additional funding that we believed would offset that, but the school board made that decision, and the honourable member is tied to the decision that they've made.
The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre.
Mr. Speaker, last week I asked the Minister of Health if he could assure me that no Pay for Plasma clinic would open in Nova Scotia. According to Canadian Blood Services, Pay for Plasma schemes represent the most serious threat to the sustainability of our public plasma supply. In December of 2016, the board chair of the Canadian Blood Services wrote to our then Health Minister asking that Nova Scotia pause any paid plasma developments. So I'd like to ask the Minister, what action has been taken to address the concerns by the Canadian Blood Services? And I should have tabled that.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. I believe this is a topic that will be discussed a little more detail later this afternoon, Mr. Speaker, as I believe that piece of legislation is actually on the order paper. But indeed, Mr. Speaker, I think the member answered her own question. The request was dealing with, I believe the language was pausing any paid for plasma. I believe the language she used was schemes, Mr. Speaker. Indeed, to my knowledge, there are no paid for plasma initiatives or plans slated in the province of Nova Scotia. There's no direct action needed to put a pause to any initiatives that don't currently exist. Thank you.
The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre.
Mr. Speaker, according to documents obtained through a federal Freedom of Information request, a for-profit plasma clinic has singled out Nova Scotia as a target market in its 2016-17 business plan. The plan notes that this company will begin to collect plasma from healthy donors immediately upon receipt of any regulatory approval, and I'll table that. Health Canada has already granted approval, leaving the door wide open for private companies to come and set up shop here in Nova Scotia. Pay for plasma clinics exploit the health of the low-income Nova Scotians and jeopardize our vital health care resources. My question for the Minister of Health and Wellness is, what is this government's plan to protect our crucial blood supply from for-profit interference?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And again, in Nova Scotia, for the benefit of members that aren't familiar with our process for blood collection, is that it is a national organization, Mr. Speaker, the Canadian Blood Services, that organize to collect blood collections across the province and indeed across the country. They collect these donations from the Nova Scotians in our province that take the time to donate, and certainly take this moment, Mr. Speaker, to encourage all of my colleagues here in the legislature to roll up their sleeve at the next opportunity to make their donation if they haven't done so lately, Mr. Speaker. And again, as the member mentioned in her own remarks, that organization that she's referencing had plans in 16-17. We're now into the 17-18 fiscal year. Thank you.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Education. Mr. Speaker, last week I received a call from a constituent whose daughter is in grade 9 French Immersion. Her daughter is short 3 teachers this year, one in the core subject of science. Mr. Speaker, I've also heard examples in Dartmouth where students are receiving instruction in English in their French Immersion math classes. My question is this, Mr. Speaker. How is the Minister of Education fixing the shortage of core French and Immersion teachers? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The member brings forward a very important point. There is a national shortage of French teachers. That is not a Nova Scotia specific challenge. That is national. However, we are recognizing that has created a challenge for a number of our schools and immersion programs. So we are working with our BED programs to ensure that we have more French grads coming into the system who have the credentials and skill set to fill in those positions that are required. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the Minister knows, the teacher shortage is widespread, and it's impacting program delivery in our province, in our classrooms. Even the Dartmouth All-City Music Centre, which is staffed by HRSB, can't fill the gaps. Mr. Speaker, what is the Minister's plan to ensure every class has a consistent teacher? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I will note that our government has hired over 760 teachers full-time in our province, Mr. Speaker. That has been a focus of ours, whether they're being applied to class caps, special needs, or for math and literacy supports, Mr. Speaker. There is a national challenge right now with French-speaking teachers. We recognize that and are working specifically with our wonderful institution down in the Clare area in St. Anne's to make sure that we're producing the amount of grads from the BED program there to fill the demand that we have in our classrooms. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Pictou West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Minister of Health and Wellness. Nova Scotians know that Pictou County lost its mental health unit 2 years ago under this Liberal government. It's been most sad and frustrating to see Pictou County residents struggling with mental health issues have to travel as far as Sydney and Yarmouth to be assessed. A couple arrived at the Aberdeen Hospital emergency Friday evening at 3 p.m. One was suicidal. At 5 p.m. they were told that the psychiatrist was gone for the weekend and would come back if they could come back Monday. Does the minister believe it's acceptable to tell a suicidal individual to wait 2 days and come back on Monday?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I believe the member, as I believe all members in this legislature, take the mental health very seriously. That's why in this budget, Mr. Speaker, we've invested heavily in mental health investments. I believe all combined, inclusive of health as well as education, about $8.6 million going towards new investments towards mental health, getting about 70 additional clinicians across the province through our schools and in our communities, Mr. Speaker. Additional investments at the IWK to bring along access to video conferencing to provide their level of expertise to communities outside of Halifax as well, Mr. Speaker. So again, we do take this very seriously, and that's why we're investing to improve services.
The Honourable Member for Pictou West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for his answer. I hope some of that $8.6 million will see results in Pictou County. This past week, I've had 3 calls from constituents with mental health issues saying that their psychiatrist called and was sorry, but they can no longer take them because they are overwhelmed and too busy. 1 in 5 people suffer from mental health issues. 46,000 people live in Pictou County. Does the minister believe that 1.5 psychiatrists in Pictou County can serve all those in need with mental health issues?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the member again for this question. Again, the role of various clinicians, not all mental health services indeed are provided by psychiatrists, and indeed many mental health conditions and supports are provided by other healthcare professionals, not just psychiatrists, Mr. Speaker, including social workers, nurses, Mr. Speaker, and psychologists. There are many different healthcare providers that provide supports that are very important in helping our individuals with mental health challenges. There's a wide range, Mr. Speaker. I think it's also important to understand that there's a very wide range of mental health supports that are needed because of the conditions of individual patients at any given time. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Queens Shelburne.
No.
Oh. Pardon me, Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
All right, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Health. Nova Scotia, like other provinces in Canada, are already struggling to deal with the senior tsunami that we all saw coming 10 to 20 years ago. Current policies to have our elderly age in place sound very good, but that's in theory. The procedures that we need to have in place to be successful require sufficient staffing levels of all levels of health care and home care, specifically the CCAs and LPNs, because they're the ones most frequently sent in. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Minister is that currently we do not have enough CCAs and LPNs in the system to provide enough home care to help all seniors age in place. So I'm asking what the government's plan is to address that shortage. Thank you.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. Indeed, as the members of the Legislature would know, three key priorities for this government, indeed in my mandate, Mr. Speaker, are work to improve primary care access, mental health services, and continuing care is the third major pillar of my mandate, Mr. Speaker. Within that space, Mr. Speaker, I think there's been a lot of good work done. I'd like to acknowledge the work that my predecessor, the current Minister of Community Culture and Heritage, has made on enhancing services and supports, reducing the wait list across the province, Mr. Speaker, significantly in his time and the work that he's done. I'm going to continue that work, Mr. Speaker, with the NSHA and our partners providing those home care support services. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My next question is for the Minister of Labour and Advanced Education. Over the past 3 months, I had several calls from frail seniors in my constituency who were advised that their health and mobility impairments supported daily home care, not necessarily health care, and I like to make a distinction because there is one. Almost every weekend this summer and on holidays, all 9 agencies supplying CCAs and LPNs cancelled the services for all of them because they did not have enough staff. 2 weeks ago, one person, who I won't mention, lay on the floor from Friday afternoon after a fall until they were found Monday morning. My question to the Minister is, as the waitlist time for the Nova Scotia Community College for LPNs is now 4 years and CCAs is between 1 to 3 years, depending on where in the province, will the Minister advise us what his plan is to address the shortage of LPNs and CCAs?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, and I welcome the opportunity to talk about...
Pardon me, the Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our community colleges, one of the things our community colleges do is when they assess the courses they offer, they match those courses to what the job market is out there. They try to get the right amount of positions offered for what the jobs will be. They try not to have too many or too little. I can tell the honourable member that in the Cape Breton area, one area I was looking at, we have had increases in enrollment there due to more demands. And if she has a specific area that's under-serviced, I'd be more than happy to take that back to the community college. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it was a year ago that residents of Sydney, Cape Breton lost their homes and belongings to flooding. While many people did receive some assistance from insurance and government, there is still frustration about the amounts people were expected to pay out of pocket to replace what they lost. At the time, the member for Yarmouth, then minister responsible for EMO, told CBC Cape Breton's Information Morning that the relief program had limits. For example, he said it wouldn't replace high-end appliances. Question, Mr. Speaker, does the Minister of Municipal Affairs agree with that member's comment that the residents of Sydney should have to pay out of pocket to replace items lost in the flood?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the Honourable Member for the question. I'll start by thanking EMO, thanking the Department of Municipal Affairs, thanking the Department of Environment, thanking the Department of Transportation for all the support that they provided to the families at home. So, Mr. Speaker, we took an $80,000 program to $200,000. When we realized the severity of the situation, we removed that $200,000 cap and went to market value. If somebody's house was worth over $200,000, that's what they received. We looked after all of their meals and their accommodations until they signed off on their disaster relief applications. We covered incidentals, and we covered all fees necessary for them to get through that process. We also put in an appeals process that if they didn't like the appraisal that they received on their market value, Mr. Speaker, I can stay to my place today as the MLA MLA for that area to say we did everything we could for those families in Cape Breton.
The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre.
Mr. Speaker, in a story in the Cape Breton Post on Monday, one resident said, seemed like a bit of divide and conquer, and that those who were tasked with supporting and helping residents could have done a much better job. It's a year later, and people in Sydney still have concerns about the values of their home and the prospect of future flooding. Mr. Speaker, is the minister satisfied with his government's response to last year's flooding in Sydney?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, I'm satisfied with this government's response, but I'll tell you who I'm satisfied with. I'm satisfied with every first responder that went out in the height of that storm to look after those families. I'm proud of the work that the United Way and the Salvation Army did to help hundreds of families, provide them with food and the essentials that they needed to get by after the flood. Mr. Speaker, I can stand in my place today and also say that I'm proud of my Premier who went into those homes, looked those families in the eye, said they weren't alone, and every one of them are in a new house today.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister responsible for the Provincial Lottery Corporation. In 2005, the government of the day released Nova Scotia's first gaming strategy. The strategy was intended to direct gaming policy in Nova Scotia for 5 years. It included a number of measures such as reducing the number of VLTs in the province. Then in 2011, the government of the day presented an update to that gaming strategy. Here we are in 2017, it's 6 years later. That policy has now expired last year. So my question for the Minister is, without a current gaming strategy, can the Minister tell this House what is guiding gaming policy in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you to the member for the question. We have a gaming policy. We certainly have to make sure that it does provide opportunities for safe, responsible gaming in this province, and we will make sure that we continue to make whatever adjustments we need so that that mandate can be met.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The current gaming policy expired a year ago, and one of the commitments of that gaming policy that is apparently in force today was the commitment to make the My Play system mandatory on all VLTs in the province, a commitment that has since been reversed, obviously. So if nothing else, this reversal highlights the need for a new gaming strategy. During the 2011 strategy process, this government, then in opposition, called for an open and transparent strategy update. So my question for the Minister today is, will the Minister heed the call of Liberals past and promise to update the now expired gaming strategy?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and to the member opposite. Commitment of this government continues to be looking at responsible gaming strategies in this province. If that requires an update, that's what we will be doing, but we want to make sure that we have provided and lived within a mandate for the safe gaming in this province.
The Honourable Member for Sackville-Beaverbank.
Yes, thank you again, Mr. Speaker. In August, the Department of Municipal Affairs received the Municipal Review of Fire Services in Nova Scotia. I would table that report. This, Mr. Speaker, is the latest in a series of fire reports that have come forward, and it recommends that a municipal risk analysis and fire master plan be created. My question, Mr. Speaker, is what feedback has the Minister provided to municipalities to provide direction for future planning?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the Honourable Member for the question. I'll start by thanking and recognizing all of our volunteer fire departments across the province who day in and day out serve our communities, protect our communities, and are role models and ambassadors in communities across the province. I have received the report, and I know our staff has been in contact with some of the communities. That report specifically had more stakeholders than ever before go across the province to receive feedback on volunteer fire services. We continue to work with those organizations to see what we can do. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Sackville-Beaverbank.
Yes, thanks again, Mr. Speaker. The report, of course, recommends that there needs to be changes made both to the Municipal Government Act as well as the Fire Safety Act. and talks about currently the silos in fire services across the province that need to create consistency and efficiency for public safety. I'm glad to hear the minister talk about his respect for fire services and the personnel across the province, and this is part of how the province can show that that they do value their work. Mr. Speaker, can the minister tell this House when you'll be moving the recommendations forward by changing legislation and funding the necessary next steps to adopt this report?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank the member for the question. We haven't made any decisions yet based on the recommendations of the report, but what I can tell the member is that all groups are working together with municipalities, elected officials, our department, and first responders within those communities. We do whatever we can to support our first responders. We have the First Responders Fund that we give out each year to communities that can apply and access the necessary funds to support some of the important equipment that they need to protect their communities, and we'll continue to have those conversations to ensure that we can support those communities that step forward to provide fire services to protect the people in their homes.
The Honourable Member for Cumberland North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, when I brought up the discussion of the Cobequid tolls to the Minister of Business, one of the comments back was that he may be open to consultation with the truckers, with the business community of Cumberland. I'm wondering if he would be willing to make that commitment, to do a consultation process. The idea of leaving the Cobequid tolls on for the businesses of Cumberland North would be an undue hardship. They've quoted prices like $7,400 per truck per year extra in tolls and tariffs. Would the Minister of Business make a commitment today to do a consultation with the business owners of Cumberland?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I do thank the member for the question. Again, what we had said all along was that the tolls would be removed for Nova Scotians when the principle, the interest, and some of that capital requirement to keep the 104 whole were in place. And we know that we're probably 2 years or less away from that, and I think we all look forward to that day. At that point, and leading up to that point, Mr. Speaker, we want to figure out what's the best approach for Nova Scotia. There's still going to be a lot of maintenance, a lot of capital, a lot of work to be done to keep the 104 in the great condition that it's in. And again, to the Premier's point, continue to make mobility fantastic, and of course, paramount to that is safety, keeping people alive and getting them home safe and sound with their families. So, Mr. Speaker, when we have the conversations about ongoing tolls, what could be the mechanism moving forward, it'll be a conversation we have with all Nova Scotians and certainly truckers and commercial vehicles in her area, in the region, and all commercial vehicles will be part of that discussion. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Cumberland North.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the Minister for the answer. I would really recommend the Minister of Business to talk directly with the Truckers Association, even throughout all of Atlantic Canada. And I do appreciate there are significant costs to maintaining that stretch of highway. However, there's a cost to maintaining all the highways in this province, and we pay a gas tax for that. And I don't believe that the businesses in Cumberland should be penalized if they have lobsters to go from Pugwash to the port or lumber to the mill. We shouldn't have to pay that extra cost. So will the Minister of Business make a true commitment today to consult with the business owners of Cumberland?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Again, thank you for the question to the Honourable Member, and thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, part of the problem is about the open communication and getting all the facts on the table. Lots of times when we talk about the discussion of tolls, and we saw that in the wide sweeping consultation that we held last year, our government put together, which was the first of its kind. The reality is that people think that we collect enough in gas tax to pay these bills. That's not even close to the reality, Mr. Speaker. If you took all the gas tax we collect in this province, all the RMV fees we collect in this province, we're still about $80 million short to pay the current amount we put out in transportation each and every year. So we're doing what we can with the money we collect. We're adding money on top of that to make sure that our highway grid, our network, and our arterial roads are safe and sound. We'll continue to do that. And again, we will consult with the truckers. We will consult with everyone that's a stakeholder with a vested interest in this conversation. But at the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, we've got to be concerned with all Nova Scotians, the business community, everyone. We will have that wide open dialogue because we just want to get this right.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham.
Mr. Speaker, this is a question for the Minister of Immigration. We know Nova Scotian universities have focused for years on bringing international students to Nova Scotia. However, there's more that we can do to make them feel welcome. Currently, international students are not eligible for MSI until they've been here for 13 months. Last week, the Government of New Brunswick announced they will provide MSI coverage for all international students, their spouses and dependents throughout their degree program. Will our minister commit to establishing a similar program here in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Immigration.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you very much to the member for that question. Immigration is an extremely top priority for Nova Scotia and for this government. We have invested a lot of money. We have worked extremely hard in all our programs. In terms of international students, we've opened up streams that never existed before. In order to bring them here, we're working with our university sectors. With respect to the health questions, it is a topic that we have met with the students about in the last year. It is one that we continue to explore. There's much work to do on that, but in terms of international students, we have opened up streams for them to nominate them to permanent residency, and I'm extremely proud of the work that we're working across all our university sectors. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Minister for her answer.